We are just about a week away from the premiere of Ken Burns' new documentary on the American Revolution and how the founding of America 250 years ago turned the world upside down.
The founders thought we can start over again. We can begin the world anew.
The British objective is to suppress the rebellion, force them to acknowledge the authority of the king.
Washington understands the war he's fighting. He doesn't have to win. He only has not to lose.
The six-part, 12-hour documentary will examine how 13 British colonies on the Atlantic coast rose in rebellion, won their independence, and established a new form of government that radically reshaped the continent and inspired centuries of democratic movements around the globe. The documentary takes an in-depth look at the virtues and contradictions of the war and the birth of the United States of America. And you can join us for an exclusive preview of the American Revolution coming up next Wednesday, November 12th at SUNY Plattsburgh. You'll be able to watch selected scenes from the film and join in a community conversation featuring experts from both Fort Ticonderoga and SUNY Plattsburgh. You can go to our website to reserve your seat. We also held a screening a few weeks ago at historic Fort Ticonderoga, where more than 100 people turned out to get a sneak peek at the documentary. And then a real treat, a panel discussion with two of Fort Ticonderoga's historians, Dr. Matt Cagle, the museum's curator, and Stuart Lilly, who is Vice President of Public History, who both talked about what led to the Revolution and some of the most significant events and battles that took place at and around Fort Ticonderoga.
One of the neat things that we have here is our French and Indian War story. And what's amazing is even in these moments of triumph, American soldiers serving right alongside British soldiers, vanquishing their enemy of generation, the French menace to the north, as they so often thought about it. Even within these moments of triumph, you could tell that there was an uneasiness, that they didn't quite work well together. There were a lot of issues, too, that became taxation without representation, which in the midst of a war, as everyone's finding a way to cooperate together for their mutual imperial gain, questions like in Virginia, the two-pistole tax that Parliament tried to levy directly on Virginia. They were able to eschew that in the name of fighting on this common cause. And once that war was over, and Americans didn't feel like they got the proper benefits for their participation in this fight for empire, and at the same time, the British ministry felt as if they had paid an inordinate price for their mind, defending Americans. This path of divergence had already been set in many ways.
Yeah, I think it's really smart to bring it back to the previous conflict, which we have the benefit of being able to engage with here, because it's a direct part of this building, quite literally. I think the introduction that you saw, the Burns production company very clearly acknowledges the diverse reasons that America went to war, and it's also it's worth remembering that America in 1775 is not the America of 1776, to say nothing of the America of 1781 or 83 or 89. It's a dynamic, evolving atmosphere, and there is an economic factor. There is taxation being levied on Americans. In some cases, maybe not for the first time, but for the first significant time. If they'd gone back to England and asked the taxpayers there, the English taxpayers would say, "What are you talking about? You pay nothing." Same thing the Germans do. When German auxiliaries come to America, they say, "You're rebelling against this plenty that you have? This is remarkable." But there are other things too. It's not just that. There's an aspect of something we talk a lot about here, especially being right now when we're looking at this 250th anniversary of 1775. Many Americans who are fighting not necessarily purely for economic reasons, but for what they feel are the rights, the liberties that they have inherited as British subjects. And the position of Great Britain and their laws in the European and the Atlantic world as being, the freest of the free. The English are the freest people. They're not at the whims of an authoritarian monarch like in France. where there's this, God-given right of kings. The Englishmen are free to live their lives, to own property and land, to speak out against the government. This is a huge crisis before the war in England, where an English politician named John Wilkes is arrested for seditious libel, for speaking his mind against the government. And his arrest becomes this huge cause for politicians in England, radicals and others, to say, well, no, in England, we can do this. We can speak our minds, even if it goes in opposition to the government. And that cause gets picked up by Americans. It does fuel Americans' eagerness to go to war in 1775. There's a reason that there's a place in Pennsylvania called Wilkes-Barre. There's a reason there's a Wilkes County in North Carolina that are named after this English politician. So some of the origins of the American Revolution, are also connected to transatlantic resistance against, authoritarianism, tyranny. Tyranny comes up again and again in the American vocabulary of this era. And there's other ones as well. There's land. There's Americans have much more land and the opportunity to gain land than anyone else in Europe, certainly. But that's also cut off by the British government, who says, well, no, there are people out there, and they legally prohibit settlement westward onto native lands. And Americans say, well, no, we want this. We fought a war for this, and we want to get it. And so, again, the direct impact of that as an impetus for war varies from colony to colony where you are, but when you see enough of these things coming together across the eastern seaboard, then you get towards something like a collective action that becomes the American Revolution.
After the panel discussion, the audience was given a special tour of Fort Ticonderoga's museum that over the next few years will be showcasing some of their incredible collection of priceless artifacts from the Revolutionary War. By the way, you can watch the full panel discussion from Fort Ticonderoga that night of the screening. You'll find it on our website and YouTube channel. And once again, the American Revolution will be broadcast and streamed over 6 nights beginning next Sunday, November 16th, here on Mountain Lake PBS.